Hi there, it's Reed from Blue Bear Quilts. How would you like to learn how to sew binding onto your quilt top in 4 easy steps? Well, today I'm going to show you how using this quilt. It's one of my patterns that's available on my website called Celebrity Squares, and it's made with Timeless Treasure batik fabrics. So the 4 easy steps are going to be 1, preparing the strips, 2, sewing them to the quilt top, 3, joining the ends, and 4, sewing the binding to the back of the quilt. So let's get started, and I'll show you 4 easy steps to sew binding onto your quilt. The first thing that we need to do is consult the pattern, because we're going to have to cut our binding strips, and the pattern will normally tell us how many strips we need to cut. So let's see here. So it says for binding, it recommended black, but I'm actually going to use this very colorful batik instead. But it says to cut 5 2.5-inch strips. And I like 2.5-inch strips because when you're machine quilting and you fold it around to the back, you definitely have enough on the back so that your sewing machine needle will catch it. Sometimes if you go with 2 1/4, it's going to be closer to the edge, but you might also end up missing some areas and then have to go back and redo it. So I find with 2.5, it's definitely enough, and I don't need to go back and redo it. So I'm going to start off by taking a piece of fabric, and I've folded it the width of fabric so that the fold is right there, and I put it up at the top and get it lined up evenly with this, and then I'm going to put it on a line on my mat. And then I find the easiest way to cut strips is with the Stripology squared ruler. And so we're going to be cutting 2.5-inch strips, so it says that the squares, that are these squares, are what will cut 2.5-inch strips. So I'm going to line up the first square, actually, since I'm not going to be doing the whole thing, I'm going to line it up right here. I'm going to take and move this over just a little bit so that it's on a line. It is helpful to use the lines. So I'm going to put that on a line, and then I'm going to put this first square on that line. And then I'm going to take and move this black line up to the bottom of my, where the fold is on my fabric. And then I'm lining up all of these lines with the lines on the mat, and I'm also lining up down here. And basically what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the line of the mat is going right in the center of each of these grooves. And it looks like it is. So that's pretty good. So now I'm going to take and place my rotary cutter in the groove just like that, and then hold the mat down, and be careful so that you don't cut your fingers, and just right along like that. And then move to the next square, which is going to give me a 2.5-inch cut. Put it right there and cut. And move to the next one and cut. And move to the next square and cut. I love how quick and easy it is to cut binding strips with that Stripology ruler. So you'll notice I very quickly got 3 strips from that one piece of fabric, and that was actually left over from the backing of the quilt. So now I'm going to cut the other 2 that are needed, and then I will show you how we're going to join the ends of these strips. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the selvage ends off. So on the non-folded end, that's typically where the selvage is on a width of fabric. So I'm just going to take and place my ruler a little bit off the edge and cut those selvages off. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to line up all three of these pieces. I'm going to save two because those are going to be the end pieces. And I'm going to line up these three. And I'm going to show you a little trick with this ruler that makes sewing these mitered binding pieces super easy. So this is called the Creative Grids Quick Trim and Circle Ruler. And you'll notice that it has these white diagonal lines on it. So what you do is, I'm going to take this one right here, it's a 45-degree angle line, and I'm going to put that along the left edge of my binding strips, right along here like this. And then I'm going to look for this dashed line right up here, which is a 1/4 inch line, and I'm going to put that line right in the upper right hand corner there. And again, this white line is going to go along the left edge, and that's going to go in the corner. So that dashed line's in the corner, this white line is along the left edge of the strips, and I'm going to take and cut all those off. Now what that did is it makes it super easy to put these strips together. So you take two of them and go like this and like this. You see how that lines up nicely like that? And then just take and do this. And so it's doing that same thing where you crisscross them and then mark a line at a diagonal, but doing it this method, now I'm going to sew from that point right there to that point right there. And when I do that, I'll have a perfect 1/4 inch and my strips will be nice and straight. And so I'm going to do that to these other two pieces, and then I will go sew this 1/4 inch, and then I'll show you what the binding strip looks like. So now we take and sew the strips together, and you can see I've sewn from that point right there down to this point right here. And then you take and you press that seam, and then take and press it like this. And you can see how nicely that has made a mitered strip piece. And the reason for doing this is that it reduces bulk on the back, and also if there is a design between the two pieces of fabric, it makes it so that it doesn't show that the two pieces have been pieced together. So then once you've done that, you want to press these open. Press those nice and open. And then we're going to take and we're going to press so we have a long binding strip here. We have all the strips sewn together. And then you're going to take and you're going to press these in half. So you just start like this and press in half. And what I like to do is hold the iron down, and then with my other hand I take and match the pieces up like this and just go along like that. And when you get to the part that the piece was sewn together, which is right here, you just want to make sure that this lays nice and flat when you're putting it together. And then you just keep ironing along there, and so you end up with like a nice flat piece of binding to sew on your quilt. So that was step one of getting our pieces of binding prepared, and now we'll move on to step two, which is going to be sewing the binding onto the quilt. This is step two, sewing the binding to the quilt top. So we have our binding all prepared, our strip all prepared, and you're going to start on the right edge of the quilt, and you're going to first start sewing about halfway down the quilt. And so you want to leave about a 10 to 12 inch tail like this that's not going to get sewn. And so I'm just going to take and lay the raw edges. So see, this is the raw edges of the binding right next to the raw edges of the quilt. And I'm going to start sewing right down here where I've left about a 10 to 12 inch tail. And then I'm going to continue down to the binding, and I'll show you how to sew the bindings, to sew the binding at the corner. So you can see I've left this long tail on the quilt and started sewing right about there. And now I'm just going to keep sewing on down until I get to the corner. Okay, so I'm sewing along the straight edge here, and I'm going to be coming to the corner, and I'll show you what happens at the corner. I'm going to basically be stopping a 1/4 inch before the end of this edge. So I'll just sew down there and then show you what happens. And basically I'm following, on my machine there's like a little 2/8 inch line which stands for a 1/4 inch. So I'm basically putting the edge of my quilt and my binding right along that 2/8 inch line so that I get a 1/4 inch when I'm sewing my binding on. Now the way I'm going to tell when I'm at a 1/4 inch is on this particular foot. There's a hole in here, and the beginning of the hole, like closest to me, is where I am a 1/4 inch from the needle, so that when I see the edge of the quilt get to that spot, that's when I'm going to stop. And so now the edge of the quilt is right there, and it's lined up with that right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up the presser foot, turn the quilt so that I can see the corner right there. Put the presser foot back down, and I'm going to sew right off that corner. I'm going to lift the presser foot up again, and I'm going to take the quilt and I'm going to work on this corner right now. So we're going to take the binding strip and we're going to flip it up like this. And we're going to get so that it is a 90-degree angle going into that corner of the quilt. So it's straight up over here, a 90-degree angle right over into that corner. Then we're going to take the binding strip and fold it back down on top of itself and line up the raw edges again with the raw edges of the quilt. And it's okay if there's a little bit that's sticking out the top there. That just gives a little extra room for the binding in there. So I'm making sure that I've got it all nice and lined up, and then I'm going to take and move it back under the needle, and again get it lined up with that 2/8 inch line, and basically push the quilt right up against the needle like that. Put the presser foot down, start going forward, and then do a little back stitch here. Then I just keep stitching down the right side of the quilt like this. So I'm getting the raw edges lined up again, and I'm following that 2/8 inch line on my machine. And so now what I will do is I'm going to keep sewing for a little bit and get to that next corner, and then I'll show you one more time like how to do the corner. Okay, we're getting close to that other corner now. So again, I'm going to stop at a 1/4 inch before the edge of the quilt. And the way I can tell when I'm at the 1/4 inch is that the bottom of the quilt right here will be even with the first opening of that hole in the presser foot. And now it looks like they're about lined up. So again, I'm going to lift the presser foot and rotate the quilt so that that little point is aiming straight towards me. Then I'm going to lay the binding back down, and I'm going to sew right off the edge of the quilt. Then I'm going to lift the presser foot again and rearrange the quilt so that I can work on this corner. And you don't have to cut the thread, you can just leave the thread the way it is. So again, I'm going to fold up so that there's a straight line right here and a diagonal line going into that corner. Just fold the binding strip straight back and then fold it back towards you again on top of itself. And again, it's okay if a little bit of the binding is sticking out the top there, because that just gives the room for that corner to fit in there. And so again, I'm going to take and press it right up against the needle, and I'm lining up the raw edges again with my 1/4 inch line. Go forward, then take a little back stitch. And then I'm just going to continue down this edge of the quilt, sewing at a 1/4 inch along here until I get to the next corner. And when I get to the point where I will be joining the two ends together, I will join you again. Alright, so now I've finished sewing the binding all the way around the quilt and left this area open. This is the beginning strip where we left this long tail. And this is the ending strip where we ended off. And so this is now going to be step 3 of joining the two binding ends together. So we want to make sure that we have a nice big space in here, because then that makes it easy to sew the two pieces together. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So there's basically 16 inches between these 2 points. And that's good. That should give us plenty. So then the next thing we want to do is we want to take the piece of binding where we just stopped sewing, not where we started. This is the one where we started, but the one we ended with. And we want to go halfway. So 16 is going to be 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so 8 is going to be this 23 line. Let's measure that one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the 23-inch line on my mat. And then what we need to do is we need to go the width of binding as an additional step. So we're going to go 1, 2 1/2, because that's the width of my binding. So that is the line in between the 25 and the 26. So I'm just going to put that right there and go between the 25 and the 26th and snip. And you don't have to worry about this being exactly on the line, because we're going to go backwards and now measure the other direction. So again, we want to go back 2 1/2 inches, because that's how much we went past the halfway mark. So we had the halfway mark here, we went 2 1/2 inches, which is the width of our binding. That's from there to there, that was 2 1/2 inches. So now we want to measure back to find out where our center point is. So we're going to put our ruler there and go back 1, 2 1/2, so it's right there. And we're going to put a pin in there to mark that spot. And it appears that that is right on the 23 line, so I actually did a pretty good job of cutting the half. So now we're going to take and we're going to lay the first piece of the binding, this is when we first started sewing, and lay that over that. And we're going to cut it right at that 23-inch line. And that looks pretty good. So you can see it's lined up right with my pin there. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take and fold this one. This is the last part of the binding that was sewn on, and fold it up like this at a 90-degree angle. So it's straight up a 90-degree angle right there, and then we're going to take this, which was the first part of the binding that was sewn on, and lay that right there, and you see those raw edges should match up with each other. And then we're going to take and fold this piece up and match those two corners with each other. And now I can pull that pin out, and I'm going to actually take and move the quilt a little bit so that this is easier to work with. And so we're going to line up these edges like this. So get it all nice and squared there, and we're going to take and put a pin in here. And we're going to take another pin and put it over here. And I might have to move this pin a little bit because it's going to be in the way. There we go. So now we're going to end up sewing from this point right there on top here down to this point right here. So it's a diagonal line that we're going to be sewing here. And I can actually eyeball this on my machine, but if you're not sure you're going to be capable of doing that, basically take a ruler and just mark a line, you know, on your pieces so that you'll know where to sew. And then you're going to take and sew right along there, and then I'll show you the next step. Now you can see that I've sewn a straight line from basically that point right there down to this point right here. And I'm going to remove the pins, and we want to check this and make sure that it's going to fit the quilt before we actually do any cutting of the triangles that needs to be cut off there. So I'm going to take and lay the quilt flat again. And there, you can see that it's going to lay nice and flat along the quilt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off this extra triangle here. I'm just going to do it at 1/4 inch from the edge of the stitches. Doesn't have to be exact, you can guess that one. And then I'm going to take and press it open. So again, we're reducing the bulk in this seam by pressing that open. You can do it with your hands or you can do it with an iron. Probably doesn't matter. And then we're going to take and lay this down again with the raw edges along the right side of the quilt. And I'm just going to finish stitching along here. I'm going to back stitch where I left off and continue down to where I first started sewing, and I'm going to back stitch there, and that completes step 3, and I'll be back to show you step 4, which is going to be sewing the binding around to the back of the quilt. So now I'm sewing the binding to the back of the quilt, and I started up ahead here a little bit and basically just back stitch where I started, and I'm stitching right in the ditch. So I'm using white thread on the front because I already have white quilting stitches, and the white will pretty much blend in with the back here, so that's why I chose white for the front and the back. And so I'm just stitching in the ditch, and you can go as slow as you need to so that you stay in the ditch. And the nice thing about using this white thread is if I do get off a little bit and it goes on top of the binding, it's going to blend in. And then I just remove the binding clips as I go. So there I'm going a little bit faster, but if you need to go slower so that you stay in the ditch, you definitely can do that. And you just remove the clips as you go and you keep on going. And now I'm basically going to sew down to the corner, and then I'll show you how I pivot at the corner. Okay, so here I am, I'm approaching the corner. So I'm just going to stitch down until I get there. Remove this clip. And remove this one. And hold everything in place. And I'm going to stitch right into that corner. You can go nice and slow so that you know where to stop. Then I'm going to lift the presser foot, turn it around, and start stitching down this next side. And so there you can see what the quilting looks like. Sometimes the stitching shows, sometimes it goes off onto the binding, but it's white so it doesn't really matter. So it's a fairly easy way to do it. And then on the back you end up with a little bit of a flap. That's where I was talking about how it makes sure that you're going to cover the back, because if it was shorter, you might go off here and then not actually get it. But I don't mind that little lip. But if you don't like that, instead of cutting your strips at 2 1/4, you could, or I'm sorry, 2 1/2, you could cut them at 2 1/4, and then there would be less of this flap showing. So I'm going to keep stitching along, and then when I remove this, I'll show you what it looks like in the corners. So here's what the corner looks like. You can see it's not exactly on the corner, but it does a nice job of holding it together. So it's going to hold it together, and then I like to put a quilt label on, but I find that I can't stitch it at the same time because it is more than the 1/4 inch won't cover the label. So I hand stitch this label in after I'm all done. Here's the quilt all finished. What do you think? Please let me know in the comments what you think about this particular binding and if you think it goes well with the quilt. Also, please let me know if you like these 4 easy methods or 4 easy steps to adding quilt binding to your quilt. If you like this video and would like to see other quilting videos, be sure to click on the video that's showing on your screen now. And also, if you click on the round Blue Bear quilt circle, you'll be able to subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss any future videos. So I hope you've really enjoyed this video on how to add quilt binding to your quilt in 4 easy steps. And I look forward to seeing you next time, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to make. Bye-bye.